On the morning of November 30th, 1939, a Finnish border guard named Vilho Rautiainen was standing watch near the village of Manila on the Karelian Isthmus, watching fog move across the frozen marshes when the sky behind him turned orange. The Soviet guns had opened up at 7 in the morning without a declaration of war, without an ultimatum, without any of the diplomatic formalities that nations had agreed over centuries were the proper way to begin killing each other. There were more than 400,000 Red Army soldiers already crossing the border in 8 places at once. Stalin had told his generals it would take 2 weeks. He had told his inner circle it would be 3 at the outside. The Finnish army was a third of the Soviet force, possessed almost no tanks, almost no aircraft, and almost no ammunition in reserve. The world looked at the maps and agreed with Stalin. Finland was going to disappear. What happened instead was one of the strangest, most consequential, and most morally complicated stories the Second World War produced. And to understand it, you have to begin not with Finland at all, but with a set of broken alliances and impossible choices that would, within 2 years, force Britain and Germany to fight on the same side as each other, neither of them wanting to, neither of them officially admitting they were doing it, and both of them doing it anyway. The man who sits at the center of this story is 72 years old in November 1939. He has fought in 3 wars under 2 different flags. He was born a citizen of the Russian Empire. He is a baron, a former Tsarist general, a Finnish cavalry officer, and the son of a Swedish-speaking aristocratic family that had lived in Finland for 2 centuries. His name is Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, and he is, by the time the Soviet guns opened fire, the most complicated man in a complicated country. Mannerheim had served the Tsar in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, had ridden with the cavalry across Manchuria, had risen to lieutenant general in the Russian Imperial Army before the revolution ended everything. When Finland declared independence from the collapsing Russian Empire in 1917, he returned to a country he had not lived in for 30 years and led the White forces in a brutal civil war against Finnish communists backed by the Bolsheviks. He won. He became a national hero in a country that had not yet decided what kind of country it was. And then, because Finland was a democracy, he lost an election and returned to private life, spending years in Paris and Stockholm and the great country houses of Central Europe, a soldier without a war. He came back in 1931. He was 64 years old. He took the chairmanship of the National Defense Council. And for the next 8 years, while Europe bent itself toward catastrophe, he did one thing. He built a line. Across the Karelian Isthmus, in the narrow land corridor between Leningrad and southern Finland, he constructed a defensive network of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, trenches, and wire. It was not impressive by Western European standards. It was underfunded, poorly equipped by comparison with the Maginot Line or the Siegfried Line, and Mannerheim himself said later that its greatest asset was not concrete but the soldiers behind it. He was right. He called it the Mannerheim Line. The Soviets called it an obstacle. Stalin assumed his army would break it in a week. On the morning of November 30th, when the guns opened, Mannerheim was at his headquarters in Mikkeli, a small city in central Finland, 500 kilometers from the nearest border. He was calm in the way that men who have already lived through catastrophe are calm. He had seen the Russian army from the inside. He knew what it was capable of. He also knew what it was not capable of. He knew that it had been gutted by Stalin's purges of 1937 and 1938, that the experienced officer corps had been shot or imprisoned, that the men crossing the border were led by survivors of the terror rather than survivors of combat. He told his staff to hold the line. He told them the world was watching. He did not tell them what he privately believed, that Finland could not win, that the best Finland could do was make winning too expensive for Moscow to bother trying. The Winter War lasted 3.5 months. The statistics are still astonishing. Finland, with 300,000 soldiers and 70,000 reserves, faced an enemy that eventually committed more than 750,000 troops to the campaign. The Red Air Force flew thousands of sorties over Finnish cities. Turku was bombed, Helsinki was bombed. The damage was not decisive. The Finnish anti-aircraft batteries were good, and the Finnish people proved, in the specific way that a people invaded by a neighbor they have always feared proves it, that they were not going to give ground easily. On the Karelian Isthmus, the Soviet assault on the Mannerheim line stalled. Not because the concrete was strong, but because the terrain was impossible and the Finnish soldier was extraordinary. White-clad ski troops hit Soviet columns in the forest and disappeared into the trees before the Russians could organize a response. At the Battle of Suomussalmi, a Finnish force of 11,000 men destroyed an entire Soviet division of 17,000 and then turned on a second division and destroyed most of it too, killing an estimated 9,000 Soviet soldiers while losing fewer than 300 of their own. The road afterward was lined with frozen Soviet bodies stretched out across the snow, still holding their rifles, horses frozen standing. The Finns called the destroyed columns of vehicles and dead men moti, the Finnish word for a cord of firewood stacked in the forest. But Mannerheim knew the winter would not last forever. He knew Stalin would eventually appoint a competent general and bring enough guns and enough shells to break anything the Finns could build. And Stalin did. In February 1940, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko replaced the failed commanders of the first assault and launched a second offensive with overwhelming artillery preparation. 14 divisions struck a single 10-mile sector of the Mannerheim line near the village of Suma. The concrete broke. The Finns retreated. On March 13th, Finland accepted the terms of the Moscow Peace Treaty, and the Winter War ended. Finland gave up 12% of its territory, including the city of Viipuri, its second largest. 100,000 people became refugees in a single week. The cost to the Soviet Union was, by conservative estimates, more than 125,000 dead and 300,000 total casualties in a war it had planned to win in 2 weeks. In London, Winston Churchill watched this and took note. He was not yet Prime Minister, he would be within 2 months. And what he saw in the Winter War was not just the suffering of a small democracy. He saw something else. The Soviet Union had just proved to Germany and to the world that its army was broken, that the purges had hollowed it out, that its officers could not coordinate, that its men died in pointless frontal assaults against dug-in infantry. Churchill noted this. Hitler noted it too. It was one of the reasons Hitler would eventually decide that the Soviet Union was a house that could be kicked in, that it would collapse in weeks. That decision would kill 20 million people. But that is a different story. In the spring of 1940, Churchill's more immediate concern was that Finland had surrendered 12% of its territory and 100,000 refugees, and that Britain had done nothing to stop it. Britain had, in fact, wanted to help Finland during the Winter War. There were plans drawn up, supplies promised, an Allied expeditionary force proposed, but the proposal was not humanitarian. The proposed expedition was designed primarily to cut off Swedish iron ore supplies to Germany by moving through Scandinavia under the cover of aid to Finland. The Swedes and Norwegians refused to permit Allied troops to cross their territory. Finland surrendered before the debate was resolved. And so, Britain's relationship with Finland in March 1940 was one of genuine sympathy laced with guilty conscience, not the clean simplicity of an alliance. Britain had watched Finland fight and had sent letters. It was into this world, a world of broken promises and borrowed time, that the summer of 1940 arrived. France fell in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone. The Luftwaffe spent the summer trying to knock the Royal Air Force out of the sky and failing, which meant that Hitler could not invade Britain directly. By the winter of 1940, he was already thinking east. The Soviet Union, the old enemy, the race enemy. the vast space to the east that was supposed to provide living room for the German people. He had always intended to go there. The non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939 had been a temporary arrangement, a way of keeping his eastern flank quiet while he dealt with France. Now France was dealt with. Britain was still fighting, but could not threaten him on the continent. The East was waiting. In Finland, meanwhile, Mannerheim had been thinking very carefully about what March 1940 had cost him and what it might cost him next time. Finland had kept its independence, but it had ceded Karelia, and Karelia was where more than 400,000 Finns had lived. The Karelians were now refugees in their own country. Finnish public opinion was not ambiguous. If a chance came to take back what had been lost, Finland would take it. Mannerheim was more careful than that. He was 73 years old. He had been watching European politics for 60 years. He knew that any Finnish move to recover Karelia would require a partner, and the only available partner with a common enemy was Germany. He knew what that meant. He knew what Germany was doing in Poland. He knew what Germany was, but he was a military man, and military men make calculations that civilians sometimes find cold. His calculation was this: Finland could fight the Soviet Union only if Germany was also fighting the Soviet Union. And if Germany was going to fight the Soviet Union, Germany was going to do it with or without Finland. The question was not whether Finland should join a just war. The question was whether Finland should join a war it could not otherwise survive. The negotiations between Finland and Germany in the spring and early summer of 1941 were careful and precise on the Finnish side. Mannerheim was offered command of all German forces on Finnish soil and declined. To accept would have made Finland formally part of the German military command structure. Mannerheim pressed for and received a specific understanding. Finland was a co-belligerent, not an ally. Finland's war was a continuation of the Winter War, a defensive operation to recover what had been taken by force in March 1940. It was not Germany's war. Finland was not signing treaties with Germany, not incorporating its forces into the Wehrmacht, not endorsing National Socialist ideology or German war aims in the West. Finland was doing one thing: taking back Karelia. Mannerheim put this in writing. He told his government and he told Berlin. He told the German liaison officers who came to Helsinki that Finland would fight to its old border, and then it would stop. He did not ask for permission to say this. He stated it as a condition. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. 3.5 million German, Romanian, Finnish, Hungarian, Italian and Slovak soldiers crossed the Soviet border simultaneously. The largest military operation in the history of warfare opened on a front of more than 1,800 miles. German aircraft used Finnish air bases to strike Soviet positions. 3 days later, the Soviet Union bombed Helsinki, Turku and Lahti, the major Finnish cities, and Finland declared war. The continuation war had begun. In London, Winston Churchill faced the strangest calculation of his political life. He had spent 20 years as the loudest anti-communist voice in British public life. He had called Bolshevism a disease, had supported Allied intervention against the Bolsheviks in 1919, had written essays and given speeches on the dangers of communist expansion with a consistency that his political opponents had always used against him. And now the Soviet Union was being invaded by Germany, and Churchill had to decide what Britain would do. He made his decision the same evening. He broadcast to the nation. He said that any person or state that fought against Nazism would have British support. He said the Nazi regime could not be compared to anything that had come before it. He said Russia was now Britain's ally. He did not unsay anything he had ever believed about communism. He simply said that the greater danger right now was Germany, and Britain would fight the greater danger. This was the correct decision. It was also the decision that created the problem. Because now Britain was allied with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was at war with Finland, and Finland was fighting alongside Germany, which was at war with Britain. The geometry of the thing was dizzying. But Churchill did not think it was dizzying. He thought it was simple. Finland was a democracy he admired, fighting a war he understood alongside an enemy he had to defeat. The personal sympathy he felt for Mannerheim was genuine and documented. But Stalin wanted Britain to declare war on Finland, Romania, and Hungary, all the co-belligerents fighting alongside Germany on the Eastern Front. And Stalin was now the ally Britain needed to survive. The pressure from Moscow was relentless through the autumn of 1941. The Soviet ambassador called on the British Foreign Office repeatedly. Stalin wrote personally to Churchill. The message was always the same. The alliance required solidarity. Britain should demonstrate that solidarity by formally declaring war on Germany's co-belligerents. Churchill resisted. He wrote to Mannerheim in November 1941 a personal letter marked secret sent through the American ambassador in Helsinki. The letter was one of the most remarkable diplomatic documents of the war. Churchill told the Marshal that he was grieved to say that Britain would be forced to declare war on Finland in a few days, out of loyalty to the Soviet alliance. He said he hoped Finland might simply stop fighting, that the winter gave adequate reason to halt operations, that no formal announcement would be required. He said he wished he could convince the Marshal that the Allies were going to defeat Germany. He was apologizing, in the language of statesmen, for something he was about to do and did not want to do. Mannerheim read the letter. He replied politely. He declined. Finland was not finished fighting. The territory had not all been recovered. Britain declared war on Finland on December 6, 1941, Finland's Independence Day. Churchill told the War Cabinet the declaration would not assist either the British cause or the Soviet cause. Harold Macmillan, who would later be Prime Minister, wrote in his diary that it was an error. The Americans, when they entered the war the next day after Pearl Harbor, did not declare war on Finland. They left their diplomats in Helsinki and used them to quietly encourage Mannerheim to disengage from the German alliance. The difference between the American and British approaches to Finland is a small study in how nations manage the gap between what they believe and what they are forced to do. The technical state of war between Britain and Finland was nearly without content. There was one naval engagement in the summer of 1941 when British aircraft attacked German shipping in the Norwegian port of Kirkenes near the Finnish border, and Finnish anti-aircraft batteries fired on them. It was brief. It was not the kind of fighting that defines a war. For most of the period between December 1941 and September 1944, Britain and Finland were legally at war with each other, while British Arctic convoys passed within miles of Finnish territory, carrying supplies to the Soviet Union. And Finnish soldiers and British soldiers were both alive because neither side had any particular interest in killing the other. The Arctic convoys are part of this story in ways that are rarely told together. After Barbarossa, Britain began sending war supplies to the Soviet Union by sea, around the northern tip of Norway, through the Barents Sea to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The route was the most dangerous supply line in the war. German U-boats worked it continuously. German aircraft based in Norway attacked the convoys from the air. The surface fleet, including the battleship Tirpitz anchored in the Norwegian fjords, threatened to destroy any convoy it could reach. The merchant seamen who sailed these routes in Arctic darkness and Arctic cold, through gales that could freeze a man to the deck in minutes, faced a combination of enemies that made every crossing a calculation of survival. In July 1942, convoy PQ-17 scattered. It had been ordered to disperse after British naval intelligence received word that the Tirpitz had left port. The scattered merchant ships were attacked by U-boats and aircraft for days. 24 of 35 ships were sunk. 153 merchant seamen died in the water or on burning ships. The intelligence assessment that prompted the scattering order was wrong. The Tirpitz never attacked. The convoy was destroyed by a ghost. It is still considered one of the worst convoy disasters of the war. But the convoys continued. They had to. The Soviet Union needed the supplies, and without the Soviet Union fighting Germany in the east, Britain could not survive in the west. What connects the Arctic convoys to Finland is geography. The supply route to Murmansk ran through waters that Germany controlled with forces based partly in northern Norway and partly in Finnish Lapland. The German army of Lapland, stationed in northern Finland with Finnish permission, menaced the approaches to Murmansk from the landside. Its presence forced the Soviet Union to maintain large defensive forces in the Kola Peninsula rather than deploying them southward. Its presence also made the Northern Sea route more dangerous, because German reconnaissance aircraft could operate from Finnish airfields. When Churchill looked at a map of the Arctic convoy route and then looked at a map of Finnish and German positions, he saw a problem he could not solve diplomatically and was not going to solve militarily. Finland was too peripheral, too small, too complicated, and too admirable to make into an actual enemy. Mannerheim, meanwhile, was making calculations of his own. He had recovered the Karelian Isthmus by September 1941. He had stopped his army at the old border as promised. The Germans pressed him repeatedly to advance further, to cut the Leningrad supply line, to push east past Karelia into Soviet territory proper. He declined. He was an old man, and he had fought enough wars to know what winning looked like. Winning for Finland in 1941 looked like Karelia recovered and a Finnish soldier not dying anywhere east of the 1939 border. Germany wanted Finland to participate in the siege of Leningrad. Mannerheim refused. This refusal was one of the most consequential decisions made on the Eastern Front, and it is almost never discussed in histories written in English. If Finland had participated in the siege of Leningrad, the siege might have succeeded. 900 days of starvation, bombardment, and cold killed more than 800,000 Soviet civilians inside the city. If the Finnish army had closed the northern supply route across Lake Ladoga, the number would have been higher. Mannerheim would not close it. He stopped his army where he had said he would stop it. He also, in 1942, stopped attending German military conferences. He reduced the frequency of his communications with German headquarters. He watched the war with the eyes of a man who has been in enough wars to know which direction the current is moving. At Stalingrad in February 1943, 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded and destroyed. Mannerheim looked at the maps. He began making quiet inquiries through diplomatic back channels about the terms on which Finland might exit the war. Those inquiries would take 2 years to resolve, but he had begun. In Germany, the men who ran the war made no such calculations. They could not afford to. They were too far in. The war on the Eastern Front had consumed more than 1 million German soldiers by the end of 1942, and the end was not in sight, and the alternative to winning was too terrible to contemplate, and so they did not contemplate it. They went forward. They had no other direction to go. By the summer of 1943, Germany was on the defensive in the east, and the Western Allies had landed in Sicily, and Italy was about to change sides, and the strategic situation that Hitler had told himself would not arise. The two-front war, the nightmare, was arriving on schedule, the way nightmares always do. For Finland, 1943 and 1944 were years of waiting in a burning building and looking for the exit. Mannerheim knew the Germans were losing. He knew that when they lost, Finland's position as a co-belligerent would be a problem to be settled, and that the Soviet Union would be the one settling it. He tried to negotiate directly with the Soviet Union in February 1944, sending diplomatic signals through Stockholm. Stalin's terms were harsh, harsher than Finland could accept. The negotiations failed. In June 1944, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive on the Karelian Isthmus, the same territory Finland had recovered in 1941. It was the largest Finnish battle of the entire war. The Finnish army held, barely, against an enemy that had learned in 3 years of fighting how to conduct combined arms operations in a way the Red Army of 1939 could not. The front stabilized. The Soviets did not push through. But Finland could see what the next offensive would bring, and it did not have the men or the ammunition to stop it. In August 1944, Mannerheim became president of Finland. The political signal was unambiguous. He was the man who would end the war. And in September 1944, Finland signed the Moscow Armistice with the Soviet Union. The terms were painful. Finland gave up Karelia again, permanently this time. It ceded the Petsamo region in the far north, which had been Finnish and which held valuable nickel deposits. It agreed to pay war reparations to the Soviet Union of $300 million over 6 years. And it agreed to expel all German forces from Finnish territory within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. There were 200,000 German soldiers in Finnish Lapland. The Soviet Union, Finland's new peace partner, demanded they be gone in 2 weeks. It was an impossible deadline, and both sides knew it. But the armistice required that Finland demonstrate good faith, and demonstrating good faith required Finland to actually fight the Germans it had spent 3 years fighting alongside. The country that had been at war with Britain while co-belligerent with Germany would now be at war with Germany while nominally at peace with Britain. The geometry of alliances had produced something that no map could explain cleanly. The Lapland War began on September 15, 1944, and lasted until April 1945. It was fought in one of the most remote and inhospitable theatres of the entire Second World War. Northern Finland in late autumn and winter is a place of permanent darkness, permafrost, rivers that freeze solid in October and flood catastrophically in spring, distances measured in hundreds of empty kilometers between settlements. There were no good roads. There was one railroad, the German Army of Lapland. 200,000 men under General Lothar Rendulic had been the Finnish army's ally and guest for 3 years. The Finnish soldiers who now advanced against them had fought beside some of these same units in 1941. Rendulic had orders from Berlin to hold northern Finland as long as possible, delaying the Soviet advance on Norway. He also had orders, which he chose to interpret broadly, to deny the advancing Finns any resources as he withdrew. The result was one of the most systematic and comprehensive acts of military destruction carried out anywhere in Europe in the Second World War. As the German army retreated northward toward Norway, it burned. Every village, every bridge, every road, every building, everything that could be set on fire was set on fire. Everything that could be blown up was blown up. Mines were buried so thickly along the retreating routes that Finnish engineers could not clear them fast enough to let relief convoys through. The Lapp population of northern Finland, reindeer herders, small farmers, the indigenous Sami people who had lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, fled south ahead of the burning. 100,000 people displaced in a landscape where winter was already arriving. The provincial capital of Rovaniemi was burned to the ground. 90% of the city. Not in the heat of combat, not as military necessity, but methodically, building by building, the wooden structures of a northern Finnish city reduced to ash and embers while the German army moved north toward Norway on the one road that remained. A train loaded with ammunition caught fire at the Rovaniemi railroad station on the 14th of October and exploded, spreading the fire further. The hospitals were spared, the churches were spared, everything else burned. 40 to 47% of all dwellings in Lapland were destroyed. The scorched earth that Germany practiced in Russia and in France and in Italy, it practiced also in the country it had called a brother in arms. Rendulic was tried as a war criminal after the war. He was convicted on other charges. The destruction of Lapland was examined and ultimately not prosecuted. The legal argument was military necessity. The historical argument is harder to make. 200,000 soldiers had lived in those villages and eaten in those houses and worked alongside those people for 3 years. And they burned it anyway because they were ordered to. Because that was what armies do at the end of wars they are losing. And because the men who gave the orders were not men who counted the cost in terms of what it cost the people who owned the buildings. The Finnish army fought the entire Lapland War while simultaneously demobilizing. The armistice required it. Finland had to send soldiers home at the same time it was fighting a rearguard action against 200,000 Germans in the north. It was a military absurdity that the Finnish army managed with a discipline that says something about what kind of army it was. By November 1944, most of the German forces had crossed into Norway. The fighting in Lapland wound down through the winter. The last German soldiers left Finnish territory in April 1945. 3 weeks later, Germany surrendered. Britain's formal state of war with Finland ended with the signing of the 1947 Paris Peace Treaties, which concluded Finland's involvement in the Second World War. Finland paid its reparations to the Soviet Union on time and in full. The Soviet Union respected Finnish sovereignty. Finland became the only country that had fought alongside Germany on the Eastern Front and emerged from the war with its democratic government intact, its sovereignty uncompromised, its territory reduced, but its identity preserved. The Finns call this Sisu, a word that does not translate precisely into English but means something like stubborn endurance in the face of circumstances that argue for giving up. Mannerheim survived the war. He served as president until 1946, then retired to Switzerland, where he died in January 1951 at the age of 83. He spent his last years writing his memoirs. They are careful, precise, and largely silent on the moral questions that the continuation war raises, which is perhaps what you would expect from a man who had spent a lifetime making decisions that had no good answers. He is, in Finland, a national hero in the way that complicated men sometimes are, understood, not simply admired. There is a statue of him on horseback in Helsinki, on the boulevard that bears his name, and Finnish schoolchildren learn his story the way they learn arithmetic, as something you simply have to know. Churchill was asked, years after the war, about the declaration of war on Finland. He said it was one of the decisions he regretted. He said he had never believed Finland was an enemy. He said the alliance with Stalin had required certain things he would not have done in other circumstances. He said it the way a man says something he knows to be true and has already made his peace with. The war required it. He did what the war required. And this is the thing about the only time Britain, Germany, and Finland all fought on the same side, which is to say against the same enemy, which is to say the Soviet Union, which is to say in the specific and complicated sense that the Second World War sometimes demands when you look at it closely. They did not fight together because they agreed about anything. They did not share a cause, an ideology, a vision of the world, or a plan. Britain wanted to survive. Germany wanted to conquer. Finland wanted to get its land back. The Soviet Union was in their way, differently for different reasons, in different theaters, and so for a period of about 3 years, they all killed Soviet soldiers, even as Britain was simultaneously supplying the Soviet Union with tanks and aircraft and boots and ammunition through the Arctic convoys. And Churchill was writing personal letters to Mannerheim apologizing for being about to declare war on him. And German soldiers were helping Finnish families rebuild barns in Lapland on summer evenings before they burned those same barns to the ground 3 years later. History does this. It takes the clean lines you draw on the map and fills them in with something messier, something truer, something that refuses to be simplified without losing the thing that makes it worth understanding. The Second World War is the most documented event in human history, and it is still full of moments like this. Moments when the categories collapse, when enemies become allies and allies become enemies, when a democracy fights alongside a totalitarian state against a communist state, while also supplying that communist state and being formally at war with a country it has no interest in fighting and being supplied by the country it is formally fighting against. Finland never stopped being Finland. Through all of it, the Winter War and the Continuation War and the Lapland War and the peace terms and the reparations and the Soviet pressure that lasted for the next 50 years, Finland never lost the thread of what it was. A small country with a long border and a large neighbor and a people who had learned through the specific education that geography provides that you do not always get to choose your wars. You choose how you fight them, and you choose what you preserve when you are done. And you choose, if you are lucky and careful and led by someone who understands the difference between surviving and winning, you choose to still be standing when it is over. Mannerheim stood in his headquarters in Mikkeli on the morning the armistice was signed in September 1944. He was 77 years old. He had commanded Finnish forces through 3 wars in 5 years. Outside the window, the same Finnish forest he had always known, birch and pine and the silence of a northern autumn, stretched away to the east in the direction of Karelia, which was gone again. He did not speak about what he felt. He was not that kind of man. He signed the documents. He gave the orders. Finland had survived. That was the calculation he had been making for 5 years, and that was the result the calculation produced. And in the cold light of what the world had done to the countries around Finland during those same 5 years, Poland, the Baltic states, Yugoslavia, Greece, all the countries that had been invaded and partitioned and occupied and erased, surviving was not a small result. It was not everything. It was not Karelia. It was not the 100,000 people who had left their homes twice in 5 years and would not go back. It was not the villages of Lapland burned by the army that had been their guest, but it was Finland, still sovereign, still democratic, still standing on its own frozen ground. In the specific accounting of the Second World War, that was something. In the specific accounting of what Mannerheim had set out to do when the guns opened fire on the 30th of November 1939, it was exactly what he had promised, in the quiet way that careful men make promises, not loudly, not to cameras, but in the decisions they make at desks in the early morning while the rest of the world is still deciding what it believes. A question for you. If Finland had accepted Churchill's personal plea and halted its advance in November 1941, do you think it would have preserved its independence, or would Stalin have found another reason to demand more? Leave your thoughts below.